Imagine a small village where secrets don't just hide in whispers, but in shadows that linger longer than the day. A single white glove left in an overgrown garden sets off a chain of memories no one dared to awaken. Memories that threaten to unravel everything the villagers thought they knew. What if the past you tried to bury deep beneath the soil is still watching you, waiting for the right moment to reveal its darkest truth? Tonight join me as we walk quietly into St. Mary's Garden, where justice isn't served with noise or fanfare, but with silence so profound it shakes the very roots of memory itself. Are you ready to uncover a mystery that time tried to forget, but that refuses to stay buried? It was a numberless hour of the morning, neither night nor dawn, the kind of time when shadows stretch and secrets stir, when Miss Elira Hawthorne stepped into her garden and saw something that jarred her habitual sense of order, a daily ritual as precise as the ticking of the grandfather clock in her front hall. The air was thick with moisture, and everything around her, every leaf, every stone, every faint chirp in the fog, seemed to murmur of something hidden, as if the world itself bore witness to a secret not yet spoken aloud. The early mist coiled in slow spirals over the wet earth like fragments of an old legend dissolving into the morning air. The grass glistened with dew that still carried the quiet memory of last night's silent rainfall, and Elira, as was her routine, clutched a delicate china cup filled with warm chamomile tea, as she wandered barefoot toward the chrysanthemums that bloomed defiantly despite the season's slow decay. But something halted her just as she passed the lilac bushes near the garden's western edge, bushes that had long since withered into brittle brown, because hanging from one of the bare branches was a single white glove, so stark and deliberate in its placement, that it seemed less like an accident, and more like a message. It hadn't been blown there by the wind, nor tangled carelessly. It rested there purposefully, gently, as if set down by a hand paused in thought and never returned. The glove was immaculate, unnaturally clean for the muddy leaf-strewn village paths, and its texture fine leather, expertly stitched, betrayed a kind of city elegance that didn't belong in the rustic quiet of St. Elmsbridge. Elira stared at it without touching, her eyes scanning its seams, its silence. There was no label, no name, but the faintest trace of lavender lingered on it, a scent both nostalgic and haunting, like a love letter sealed away in a forgotten drawer for decades, still clinging to memory. Just then, a soft rustle came from beyond the hedge, too fluid to be the wind, too precise for an animal, and her spine stiffened not with fear, but with alertness. She didn't call out, she didn't move suddenly. She simply took the glove in her fingers, turned, and walked back into the house without a word. Later that afternoon, her housemaid Myra, who had served the Hawthorne household for just over a year, entered the drawing room to bring in the tea tray, but did so with a nervous clatter she had never shown before. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the cups on the table, and Elira, without looking up from her weaving, quietly asked, "Something troubling you?" Myra hesitated, twisting the corner of her apron in her fist before leaning in and whispering, "Ma'am, forgive me, but I think I saw something last night." Elira's voice remained even. "What did you see?" Myra swallowed. "A woman, dressed in white. She was standing near the sundial, just standing there, as though waiting for someone, or something. I thought maybe it was a dream, but when I went outside to check, there was no one there, no footprints, no sign of anything, and the ground was soaked. If anyone had stood there for even a moment, the grass would have bent, the mud would have taken a mark." Elira finally looked up then, her eyes calm, but distant, like stones beneath water. She didn't respond right away, only raised one brow, lightly the way someone does when they drop a stone into a still lake, and quietly wait to see how far the ripples reach. By the following morning, the tale had already begun its transformation, weaving through the cobbled streets of St. Elmsbridge like ivy through old brick. At the grocer's, a mutter about a haunted glove. At the chapel, whispers of a ghost near the sundial. By mid-afternoon, someone had claimed the glove was stained with blood, and by nightfall, the legend had grown to include an unmarked grave hidden beneath the old stones in Elira's garden. But she said nothing, she didn't correct them. She knew better than to dismiss village gossip. It was never just noise. In places like these, rumors were communal memory, a kind of psychological map where trauma and truth often overlapped. and Elira listened with a detective's ear. She watched who told the tale with nervous laughter, and who grew quiet when it was mentioned. She noticed who altered details, and who repeated them too perfectly. The glove now rested in her writing desk's second drawer, untouched, but almost humming with something unsaid. She had begun to study the faces around her with renewed attention. There was Myra, of course, whose nervous glances toward the sundial had grown more frequent. Then there was Major Drevens, a retired soldier known for his sharp tongue and perfectly polished boots, who openly mocked anything illogical, but whose eyes had lingered too long on the hedge line the previous day. And finally, Seraphine Vale, a recent arrival, who had taken up residence in the ivy-cloaked Willoughby cottage 2 months prior. She rarely ventured into town, rarely spoke, but there was something about her silence that felt stage. Not the awkwardness of solitude, but the stillness of someone hiding in plain sight. Elira had a gift, an ability to see beneath the surface, to read the negative space in conversations, and the weight of a gaze held too long. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the glove was not just a glove. It was an invitation, or a warning, and the answer wouldn't be shouted from rooftops or carved into stone. No, this mystery would whisper its truth, through nervous glances, half-finished sentences, and the things that were never said aloud. Because sometimes the deepest truths are not spoken, they're simply left behind, waiting in silence for the right eyes to find them. It was just past twilight, when the first sign came, subtle, like the delicate cracking of old wood under pressure. Miss Elira Hawthorne, ever meticulous, had returned from her routine visit to the village's decaying parish archives, her gloved fingers still faintly dusted with the scent of mildew and forgotten ink. She'd gone merely to trace the origins of an unusual architectural flourish she'd noticed in her cottage's eaves, purely academic, or so she claimed, but anyone who had known her longer than a season sensed the tug of something older, more intimate. That night, as the wind died down to an eerie stillness and the hedges cast long, unnatural shadows, Elira ventured to the garden shed to retrieve an old gardening journal she hadn't touched in years. But what she found instead, tucked neatly between pages describing moon phase planting cycles, was a folded photograph. A girl standing alone near the weathered fountain behind her home, her gaze hollow, mouth unsmiling, and eyes like damp velvet, expression unreadable yet hauntingly persistent, as though begging to be remembered. No name, no date, and yet the image seemed familiar in a way that chilled her. That very week a new figure had appeared in St. Elmsbridge. Dr. Sylvie Ravenna, claiming research into folklore of psychogeographic influence on rural estates, though her interest skewed curiously toward whispered tragedies, especially the unexplained vanishing of Alice Darrow in 1916, the last known heir of the now abandoned Wrenmere house. Sylvie's questions, though delicately framed, always circled back to that house. Had anyone inherited it? Were their journals kept? Was the garden ever redesigned after the girl disappeared? She moved through the village with a softness that disarmed, but Elira noticed how even the most stoic villagers grew tight-lipped around her. Then came the night when Elira's housemaid, Nora, pale as linen and trembling, confessed that she'd heard someone speaking behind the kitchen hedge, not loud, not quite a whisper either, but steady murmuring, as if in prayer. "I thought it was the wind," she said, "until it called my name." Twice, Elira asked no questions, only nodded, and took down her old ledger of tenant records. Days later, the fountain, long dry, began to seep water from its cracks, dark and mineral-rich, as if bleeding from the earth itself. And just last evening, while locking the side gate, Elira had caught the scent of jasmine, sharp and sudden, though none had bloomed since her mother's funeral. She turned, and for the briefest moment saw the same girl from the photograph, standing beside the cracked stone bench, head bowed, hands gloveless, waiting. Not moving, not vanishing, simply watching. Elira didn't cry out. Instead, she closed the gate and whispered, "I remember you now." She knew something had awakened, something that had waited in the folds of memory, in the quiet spaces between truth and rumor. And whatever it wasn't finished. Not yet, though the villagers of Eltmere had long agreed that the Lockwood estate harbored more ivy than intrigue. It was in the autumn of that peculiar year that silence fractured and curiosity slithered back through forgotten paths, beginning not with a scream or scandal, but with the faint clink of iron against stone, heard only by the housekeeper, Mrs. Netherley, during her dusk sweeping near the disused fountain. She dismissed it at first, blaming frost-loosened vines, until a second incident stirred her unease. A scrap of muslin, caught on the rusted edge of the sunken gate, impossibly clean and faintly scented with something antique lavender tinged with ash. Miss Thorne, who had retired to the village after decades of teaching literature in distant cathedrals of learning, found herself inexplicably drawn to the estate's perimeter walks, where the shadows stretched too long for the season, and the birds avoided the elder tree by the west wing. She had always trusted the rational, until she found, wedged between two stones of the low garden wall, a porcelain button no larger than a thumbprint, etched with a symbol not seen since the disappearance of Helena Fairmore in 1919. Helena, the girl with frost-white hair and piano fingers, who had vanished into the storm one November night, and was found, only once years later, in a dream told by her sister, and never again spoken of. But it was not dreams that troubled Miss Thorne now, it was the pale woman seen just once from her window, standing still beneath the moonlight, her face blurred not by mist but by something more resistant to memory. Days passed, then young Elias Cobb, who was too pragmatic for folklore, and too poor to ignore a £10 errand, stumbled upon the second clue while repairing the estate's weathercock, a ring of dried marigold petals hidden in the hollow of the finial, and beneath them, a child's drawing in faded graphite, a woman without eyes standing beside a window with no house. When Miss Thorne was handed the paper by Mrs. Netherley, who claimed it arrived folded in her bread tin, though the loaf was untouched and still warm, she did not speak for a full hour, simply staring at the uneven scrawl at the corner. She remembers the cold. Meanwhile, the estate's only recent visitor, a certain Clara Ashbridge, who said she came to study architectural erosion, had begun asking after the original blueprints, specifically those dated between 1901 and 1904, the same years the third floor was sealed after the so-called smoke incident. She was composed, intelligent, almost invisible in her gentleness, but Miss Thorne noted how Clara's footsteps always paused outside the chapel door longer than necessary, her eyes drifting toward the floorboards with something more than architectural concern. One evening, a third item surfaced, a photograph with torn edges, discovered tucked inside the wooden seam beneath the estate's cracked bench. A girl in a lace-trimmed dress standing before the chapel's stained glass window, her face turned but unmistakably bearing the Fairmore family brooch. Miss Thorne did not gasp or flinch, she merely laid the photograph beside the drawing, and whispered, as though to no one, "It's the window that has no house." That night, a candle flickered in the long-abandoned East Library, though no matches were kept there, and the fire grate had been empty since 1957. And somewhere, muffled beneath the groan of the wind and the hush of ivy curling its green fingers through the stone, a melody echoed faintly, piano notes, hesitant and aching, as if played by hands not accustomed to warmth, but still longing for it. The rain had barely ceased its whisper across the panes when Mrs. Elsbeth Croom, swathed in a shawl too large for her frame, withdrew a faded envelope from beneath the floorboards of her late brother's study, a space that had remained locked since his untimely passing 7 years ago. The envelope, brittle at the edges, and sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest, exhaled a scent not unlike scorched parchment and lilac, unsettling, almost medicinal. She did not open it. Instead, she sat beside the fireplace, staring into the coals with the silent gravity of someone who has heard a voice they cannot unhear. That very afternoon, Miss Everdene Grey, recently returned to the village after 2 decades abroad, wandered aimlessly toward the broken remains of the chapel garden, a place once lush with violets and scandal. There, hidden beneath a warped slab of stone, she found a child's shoe, perfectly preserved save for a curious symbol etched into the sole, a spiral inside a triangle, not unlike the mark seen on the wax of Elsbeth's letter. Meanwhile, the village doctor, Marrow, a man whose silence often spoke louder than his speech, had begun to avoid the East Road entirely, citing a persistent unease when passing the old Weathersby residence, now vacant, though a light in the attic was seen flickering after midnight. His daughter Marianne claimed in whispers that she'd seen a figure standing at the window, motionless, watching, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The parish clerk, Mr. Hollis, known for his punctuality and unbroken routine, failed to appear at Sunday's service for the first time in 21 years. His cottage, when checked, was empty, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that had not worked in over a decade, and a note on the table that read only, "She said it would be undone." Miss Everdene, increasingly troubled by the aligning strangeness, returned to the chapel garden at dusk, and there, beneath the yew tree, unearthed a rusted music box engraved with the name Celestine, a name long erased from village records, though old Agnes, the housekeeper at Glaive Manor, swore she remembered it being spoken once in a court case that never reached trial. As the wind rose and twilight crept across the fields, Elsbeth Croom finally broke the wax seal. Inside was a single photograph, 4 children faces blurred by time, except for one, eyes sharp and unmistakable. At the bottom, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "Only one of us walked away." Elsbeth turned pale. She had never seen the photo before, yet recognized the stone wall in the background. It belonged to the well behind the old mill, the well that had been bricked up after the accident no one spoke of. That night, as church bells rang out inexplicably at 2:17 a.m., Everdene stood at the well's edge, clutching the music box to her chest. Somewhere behind her, unseen, a gloved hand reached through the fog, hesitant, trembling, deliberate. And in that moment, the village exhaled a truth it had buried far too long. Beyond the winding hedgerows where time seemed to falter and memories hung heavy like mist over the marshes, Edmund Hawke's cottage brooded in its seclusion, slouched into the hillside as though ashamed of what it remembered. For nearly a year the door had remained bolted, its windows blind to the world, as if trying to forget what it had once borne witness to. But in villages like Bracken Hollow, silence never truly lasts, it only waits to be broken. Whispers began, as they often do, with the postmistress dropping a cup at the mention of an unfamiliar name. Then came Mrs. Grantham, always too quick with memory, and too slow with denial, who told anyone listening that a letter had been found on Edmund's desk, addressed not to a friend or solicitor, but to a woman. The initials scrawled with a hand trembling, either from fear or from something long repressed. He never posted it. Perhaps he never meant to. Perhaps the letter was a confession, or a farewell, or a trigger. Miss Wren from the bookshop, whose quiet presence had long masked a hawk-like vigilance, remembered him asking, weeks before his death, about rare toxins used in West African rituals, something not easily traced. He had said with a half-laugh, but his eyes had looked far away, like they were already retreating into some half-buried ruin of memory. Around the same time, the vicar's niece, Miss Carraway, had sold a watercolor to a woman at the inn, who paid in crisp new notes and wore gloves even indoors. Mrs. Reeves the register had read, but her perfume was old, evocative, and unmistakable, an unsettling blend of lavender, iris and bitter almonds. The nurse who helped dress the deceased, Miss Bramley, had whispered to the grave digger that Edmund's lips were stained slightly at the edges, like he had drunk something not meant for healing, but for forgetting. And then there was the locket. No one spoke of it until Miss Etta March, who once wore Edmund's ring for a season before returning it with a tear-streaked note, confessed she had seen it years ago. Inside was a picture that had faded to sepia, and behind it, a name scratched faintly, Evelyn Rossiter, Evelyn who had vanished in 1947 without so much as a goodbye, whose disappearance had once made local news before being folded away with the rest of the war's lost ghosts. Her grave was there, hidden behind the churchyard wall, unmarked but not forgotten. Miss Mabel Denning, who kept the cemetery records in a ledger as thick as the Bible, had only once noticed the discrepancy, a burial recorded under initials alone, no visitors, no service. And now, after all these years, Miss Ellery had found soil disturbed beneath the sundial, a place where the shadows always seemed a little too dark. She called for Miss Marple, not out of panic but of reverence. With careful hands and a rusted garden trowel, the stone was lifted, and beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, lay a tin box no larger than a prayer book. The lock was brittle, the air inside dry despite the weather. Within, 3 items: a dried violet, long since faded to grey, a yellowed newspaper clipping, describing a woman's disappearance under unusual wartime circumstances, and a tiny brass key marked Vol-T, cool to the touch. The weight of the past pressed in around them, not loud, but absolute. And in that moment, as the breeze rustled the ivy and a blackbird shrieked from a nearby tree, Miss Marple understood what no one else had quite seen, that the dead do not rest, merely because the living forget. They linger, they fester, they wait to be heard. And someone, whether out of guilt, grief or vengeance, had come back to finish what had been buried in secrecy decades ago. Now, with the village breathless in its quiet unraveling, and the sundial casting its crooked shadow over the earth, it was no longer a question of who, but why. Pressed and brittle in her palm, the small silver locket bore the faintest traces of tarnish, its delicate surface etched with a date, almost faded into oblivion. August 26, 1912. Beside it, lay a torn photograph, its ragged edges, revealing for the first time the haunting full image, a pale woman whose eyes seemed to carry centuries of secrets. Miss Marple closed the box with a quiet reverence, mindful that the sundial outside might mark the passage of hours, but certain truths were never truly buried, they only slumbered, waiting for the right moment to claw their way back into the light. The confession that followed came not with theatrical flourish, but with a steady, almost resigned calm, that belonged to someone long acquainted with silence and shadows. Cecily Vane, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, revealed her lineage to Miss Marple, not as a trivial detail, but as a heavy truth she could no longer carry alone. She was the niece of Veronica Elstone, daughter to a sister she never knew, an aunt whose absence had echoed like a hollow chord through her entire upbringing. The family had shrouded the tragedy in silence, labeling it an accident best forgotten, but Cecily's restless spirit could not abide loose ends. She had traced the faint contours of a story that refused to settle into peace. Unlike the official account, she doubted Veronica had simply drowned. The whispered quarrels, the inexplicable disappearance of the body, and the sudden withdrawal of a man once consumed by love, all hinted at something darker, an unspoken fracture sealed behind locked doors. Arriving in St. Mary's under an assumed name, not to deceive, but to observe without the crushing weight of family expectations, Cecily's revelations stirred something profound in Miss Marple's mind. Blood, after all, beckoned to blood, even across the veils of time and fog. The story, pieced together from unlikely threads, emerged through a gardener named Rudge, whose memory was peculiar, recalling events not by dates, but by weather and scents. Prompted by a casual mention of the now vanished apple tree, Rudge recounted unearthing, many years prior, a doll wrapped meticulously in silk, buried beneath the roots near a cracked marble bench, an act too deliberate to be mere child's play, a silent ceremony, or desperate concealment. Miss Marple recognized the weight of such secrets, often hidden just beneath the surface, preserved in silence and shadow. Intent on uncovering more, she arranged a lunch with Mrs. Gilliflower, an elderly former housemaid of Cranford Cottage, whose wandering mind still held flashes of clarity. Over lightly buttered toast and modest egg salad, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation towards Veronica Elstone, who had been the subject of hushed conversations and half-remembered glances. At first Mrs. Gilliflower's words were cautious, peppered with vague compliments. A delicate face, a musical laugh, safe memories that skirted the deeper truths. But as the date of Veronica's disappearance was delicately introduced, the older woman's eyes flickered, and a pregnant pause hung in the air before she whispered of a man. A shadowy figure who had crept around the back of the cottage one evening the week before Veronica vanished. Dressed in a tall dark overcoat, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if fleeing unseen eyes, he bore shoes that were polished, formal, legal-looking, not the rough footwear of the countryside. Mrs. Gilliflower could not name him, but the image lodged itself like a splinter in Miss Marple's mind, a stranger whose presence coincided with a girl's mysterious disappearance. Days later, as the village seemed to hold its breath, the whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the question remained, who was the man with the legal shoes, and what secrets did he bury beneath the surface of Cranford Cottage's fading walls? In the deep hushed sanctuary of the vicarage parlour, where the flicker of candlelight barely disturbed the heavy stillness, Mrs. Gilliflower, perhaps emboldened by the unfolding conversations that had loosened old tongues, chose to reveal a secret long buried in the folds of her memory, a secret tied to the very night Veronica disappeared. That evening, Veronica had lingered later than usual, returning from her cousin's secluded cottage, and as she made her way along Cranford's hidden rear path, the moon, pale and resolute, had just crested above the thick hedge, casting long ghostly shadows. It was then that Mrs. Gilliflower, passing quietly, had caught the faint murmur of voices, urgent but controlled, not shouting but weighted with tension. A man and a woman, locked in a desperate exchange. Concealed by instinct rather than choice, she paused in the shadows, listening intently to the fractured words carried on the cold night air, phrases like "promise me, child," and "don't trust him," a strange blend of fear and command. Suddenly, the silence shattered with the soft, purposeful movement of someone emerging from the side gate. It was a man Mrs. Gilliflower recognized immediately, Harold Kingsley. His face was ghostly pale, his hands trembling as if gripped by some unseen dread, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for something, or someone, or perhaps ensuring he remained unseen. For years, she had kept this incident to herself, convinced it was not her place to speak, and aware there was no proof to back her suspicions. Yet, Miss Marple, whose keen eye had unraveled countless village mysteries by hearing what others missed, and seeing what others overlooked, knew that truth often reveals itself not in grand declarations, but in whispers and shadows, in half-heard conversations beneath hedges. Turning her attention back to the photograph that had once been an enigma, she scrutinized the faded, brittle notations on its reverse, scribbles that at first glance seemed mere careless markings, but to her practiced mind, they formed a cryptic pattern. Comparing these strange characters to the layout of her own garden, the winding paths, the placement of the sundial, the encroaching ivy, the lilac bushes, and the ancient plum tree, a hidden map gradually emerged, not of physical geography, but of memory and meaning. The markings pointed precisely to the base of the sundial, long concealed beneath dense ivy, a spot easily overlooked but deliberately chosen, a silent testament left by grief and guilt, intended to be found only by those who knew how to look. The following night arrived, wrapped in a silence thicker than usual, pressing against the walls like a weighty secret struggling for release. Miss Marple, ever composed and untroubled by restlessness, left her window ajar, not to invite noise, but to catch the subtle rustle of hidden life. She understood well that silence was never truly empty. It breathed, it whispered, it betrayed far more than any loud clamor. Just after the clock in the vicarage struck 1, a faint deliberate sound stirred the ivy at the sundial's base, the soft scrape of stone against earth, careful and measured. No footsteps followed, no whispered voices, only the echo of retreating shadow. Someone who fled before detection but left behind a telling trace, a single white glove, soft and slender, dusted lightly with soil along its fingertips, half buried beneath the ivy. This was not the first glove to appear, Miss Marple suspected, nor would it be the last. Someone was digging up the past, awakening the garden's long-forgotten memories. While it was not in Miss Marple's nature to summon others without cause, she recognized that certain endeavors demanded not brute force, but quiet formality and measured diplomacy. Thus, she extended invitations to 2 men, the Reverend Phelps, mild-mannered and gracious, and Major Flayton, stern and skeptical, whose disapproval of the whole affair was barely concealed beneath his gruff exterior. Neither knew precisely what shadows they were to uncover, though the Major grumbled early on about the folly of turning a garden into a digging ground. Yet all 3 braced themselves, knowing they stood at the edge of a mystery, woven with sorrow and hidden truths, a puzzle waiting to be unearthed beneath the ivy and the sundial, poised to reveal secrets that had long been silenced, but could no longer be kept in the dark. In the deep stillness of the night, when shadows clung tightly to the garden, and even the faintest whisper seemed magnified, Major Flayton muttered his objections, complaining that such digging would only invite scandal and disturb the earthworms. Yet Miss Marple merely returned him her gentlest smile, the very same quiet, knowing smile she often wore just before the dawn of truth revealed itself. Slowly, the creeping ivy was pulled aside, revealing the weathered base of the sundial, beneath which lay a secret long kept. Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately caught a subtle, almost imperceptible groove in the mortar, an unevenness so faint that anyone less attentive would have missed it altogether. With the combined efforts of the reluctant vicar and the Major's sturdy elbow, the heavy stone was carefully pried loose, and what emerged was no glittering treasure chest, nor a trove of gold, but something far more precious to Miss Marple's delicate sensibilities. A modest, weathered wooden box, expertly concealed and untouched for years, its edges crumbling softly like dried petals, hinges rusted through time, yet guarding within it a collection preserved by some miracle of secrecy and craftsmanship. The vicar crossed himself in silent reverence, and the Major muttered under his breath, but Miss Marple said nothing. Her silence alone seemed to make the very earth hold its breath. Inside the fragile box lay first a monogrammed handkerchief, delicate linen, once pure white but now yellowed with age, embroidered in a faint thread of pale blue, with the initial. Miss Marple handled it with reverence, as one might cradle a relic of deep personal significance. Next, a small fragment of bone, neither large nor grotesque, perhaps a knuckle, or the gentle curve of a wrist bone, unmistakably human. The sight drained the color from the vicar's face, and even the usually composed Major fell momentarily silent. Finally, folded with meticulous care, was a letter, the ink faded, the paper brittle and fragile, sealed not with wax, but with an impression resembling a tear. Without hesitation yet with profound respect, Miss Marple unfolded it, feeling the weight of words long buried and waiting patiently to be read. The box was closed gently, the soil replaced with careful precision, and the sundial once again resumed its timeless vigil, hiding the secret beneath its shadow. But the truth, as always, refused to remain buried. The handwriting was elegant and slanted with practiced care, reminiscent of penmanship taught in finishing schools and preserved only in treasured love letters. The letter began plainly, addressing to whom it may concern, or who may still care, and within those measured words Veronica Stone's voice echoed, not frantic, not overly sentimental, but precise and deliberate, as though she had rehearsed every line before setting pen to paper. She spoke of a creeping fear, not one born of sudden fright, but the kind that settles in glances and lingers in the quiet silences, a fear that grows heavier with each passing day. She revealed the story of a man once her fiancé, whose affection had turned cold, and whose ambition had sharpened into a secret darker than any she could have imagined. A man who had fathered a child with another woman, a truth kept from the world, and most painfully unacknowledged. Veronica had uncovered this betrayal through letters not meant for her eyes, and driven neither by vengeance nor spite, but by a fierce belief that the child deserved better, she had threatened to expose him. Her words grew somber as she recounted their final meeting beneath the very sundial, where the box was found, a meeting she had attended with hope tangled tightly with dread, fearing not harm but erasure, a disappearance masked as silence. "If I disappear," she wrote, "let someone remember I did not leave willingly." Miss Marple folded the letter with a gravity that spoke volumes for all present. The voice on the page had waited a lifetime for justice, and now perhaps it would finally be heard. She remained silent, allowing the thick air of memory and the weight of newly unearthed truth to settle over them all. And now, the picture became clear. Harold Kingsley, respected, retired, a man of impeccable reserve, had not been content with the peaceful facade of age, but was a man crushed beneath the unbearable weight of secrets long buried. His silence had never been stoic resignation, but a carefully crafted strategy. A life built on hiding the truth had shaped him into a figure so reliable and orderly that no one ever doubted him, for he left no detail out of place, no clue to betray him. But beneath that perfect exterior, a storm of guilt and fear had rotted his soul. Miss Marple understood, with chilling certainty, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath earth and time, would always claw its way back to the surface. Not here, not under her garden's sundial, but somewhere, somehow, justice would find its voice at last. Gardens, much like memories, hold secrets that refuse to fade, and photographs capture moments that linger long after the smiles have vanished. But above all, guilt remembers, sharp and unyielding, and Miss Marple felt its weight settle around her like a heavy mist. She turned again to the sundial, its face weathered yet unchanging, marking time in a silent eternal rhythm, as if guarding the countless untold stories buried beneath its shadow. In her mind's eye, she saw Veronica, perhaps standing there with hope flickering quietly in her heart, perhaps with a resigned certainty, an innocent voice silenced not by the passing of years or miles, but by the insidious cowardice of those who chose silence over truth. A letter, carefully composed yet never sent, a name deliberately omitted, a series of documents all whispering fragments of a story long suppressed, but now at last, the silence had been shattered. Beneath the sundial, justice had taken root quietly yet irrevocably. With tender care, Miss Marple gathered the fragile evidence, the letter, the embroidered handkerchief, the small remains, returning to her parlor, not to rest, but to unravel the tangled threads of a puzzle more complex than she had first imagined. These tokens, the glove, the photograph, the faint trace of perfume, had not been left by chance, nor belonged solely to the departed. Each bore the subtle indelible mark of the living. Cecily Vane, poised like fine lace draped over ancient furniture, masking a grief that ran deep and cold, had come not merely to ask questions, but to shake the very foundations beneath the village's polished surface. Her act required no shovel, no dramatic spectacle, only the quiet power of suggestion. The glove laid delicately over the hedge, the photograph placed with deliberate care, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air, a ghostly echo of a girl long vanished. These were not meant to haunt but to provoke memory, to stir conscience, to awaken a sleeping guilt that had taken refuge in the shadows of everyday life. Cecily sought no revenge, never uttered a single accusation, but instead guided those around her, especially one man toward the precipice of his own concealed shame. Harold Kingsley, outwardly composed and respectable, watched helplessly, as the past unfurled like a creeping fog rising from the ground, suffocating, and inescapable, until he found himself gasping for breath in the cold grasp of his own remorse. Miss Marple recognized the brilliance of Cecily's approach, not to disrupt peace, but to disturb the silence that pretended to be peace, a silence so carefully maintained it had become a shroud. Graceful and unassuming, Cecily's silent invitation to confession was clear in the glove, a subtle summons for truth to be spoken. When Miss Marple returned to Cranford Cottage, the door hung open on its hinges, the rooms enveloped in the peculiar stillness that only places recently abandoned can possess. Cicely was gone, vanished without farewells, without announcements, without the comforting presence of the vicar's calls. Only a single note remained, placed carefully on the drawing-room table, penned in the same delicate script that had once inscribed the photograph. "The ghost is buried, let her rest now," it read, unsigned, enigmatic and final. Folding the note with quiet resolve, Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket. No police would be called, no scandal would rip through St. Mary Maid, but a truth, however fragmented, had surfaced at last. The past remained immutable, yet it had been spoken aloud, given a voice that could no longer be silenced. The sundial stood where it always had, but now the garden had released its secret, an ancient tension uncoiling beneath the carefully tended beds. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bantry's garden tea was conducted with the usual precision, the silver gleaming like cold moonlight, geraniums nodding solemnly in their terracotta ranks, seed cake sliced with the dignity of old traditions. But beneath the soft murmur of polite conversation, an undercurrent crackled with the energy of a coming storm. Miss Marple, seated in her familiar wicker chair, spoke neither louder nor softer than usual, her voice steady and calm, yet every ear turned toward her with a collective breath held in anticipation. She spoke without theatrics, her authority born from decades of quiet observation, listening, and understanding. Beginning with gratitude for Mrs. Bantry's hospitality, and the peaceful garden surroundings. She gently wove the story of the past, the photographs, the glove, the laughter that once filled Cranford Cottage, and the disappearance that had haunted the village for years. No one interrupted, for there was no need. The unveiling unfolded petal by petal, the scent of truth unmistakable and intoxicating. By the time Miss Marple reached the moment when the sundial had relinquished its secret, teacups sat forgotten, cooling in laps, while the villagers listened not as idle gossips but as solemn witnesses. The truth she revealed was not lost or forgotten. It had merely waited carefully preserved beneath layers of time and silence, now at last stepping into the light. The identity of Cicely Vane was not merely a name whispered in the shadows of the village, but a legacy entwined with unspoken sorrows and hidden reckonings, a lineage not confined to the bloodline of Veronica Stone, but stretched far deeper as an emotional inheritance fraught with grief that had been carefully buried beneath layers of silence and denial. Cicely had arrived not as an accuser brandishing blame, but as a subtle force weaving together threads of memory and conscience, her presence marked by quiet symbolism rather than overt confrontation, the delicate glove left with a calculated grace upon the sundial's ivy-clad base, the photograph discreetly positioned where only a single, haunted eye might find it, and the faint yet unmistakable scent of lavender, elusive as a ghost yet vivid to those who remembered the vanished girl who had slipped away without a sound, swallowed by the village's collective forgetfulness. It was no mere theatrical display but a finely tuned strategy, a human and profoundly compassionate gesture aimed at stirring slumbering truths from beneath the surface, coaxing dormant guilt and conscience to the light without forcing any soul to utter what was too painful to say aloud. Miss Marple explained how the garden itself had been an accomplice in this slow awakening, not just a backdrop for tragedy but a silent watchful witness that preserved the echoes of footsteps, whispered secrets and uncried tears. Through this verdant sentinel, Cicely guided the entire village, and one man, Major Fitton in particular, towards a reckoning long delayed and desperately needed. The Major, with his gruff exterior and dismissive attitude toward tales of ghosts and secrets, had hidden beneath his belligerence a fragile regret, the quiet admission of a man who had once glimpsed the fracture beneath Veronica's composed facade in her last days and had tried, in his own awkward way, to shield her from pain, warning her against a man named Kingsley. His warning had been met with a sad smile, and a promise that all would be resolved. Yet when Veronica vanished, Major Fitton had chosen silence, fearing that his knowledge would be twisted into complicity, a cowardice not of malice but of human frailty, a wound lodged beneath his skin. Miss Marple, with gentle authority, absolved him not with pity but with truth. He was not the architect of the tragedy. His failing was the powerless attempt to halt its course. Thus the suspicion long muttered in the village was finally lifted from his name, revealing a more complex portrait of guilt and innocence. Meanwhile, Harold Kingsley, the man whose guilt remained unspoken in life, had communicated his torment through silent confessions in death, the carefully altered will favoring forgotten initials, his inexplicable decline in health, the subtle but telling scent of almonds in his teacup dismissed by many but unmistakably linked to memories only a few held, and his last whispered breath of Veronica's name, a reluctant admission carried into the stillness of death. Miss Marple described how repressed guilt, once buried too deeply, had a way of surfacing not through grand gestures, but in the small repetitive patterns of life, the tremor in a hand, the hesitation before a name, the oppressive weight of a long-held silence, and how these symbolic tokens, the glove, the photograph, and the scent were not solely Cicely's doing, but manifestations of Kingsley's own haunted conscience, the man himself compelled to relive his sins through the garden's shadows, long before any spectre could. The dead do not speak, Miss Marple mused, but the guilty always do, her words a solemn echo of the truth held tight by the village's earth and memory. She spoke then not just of people but of place, of how gardens, meticulously tended and quietly bearing the scars of neglect, hold the imprints of what their caretakers wish to forget, the hurried footsteps fleeing shame, the tears shed in secret, the promises murmured under moonlight's watchful eye. The sundial, steadfast and unchanging, cast its shadow indifferent to the sorrow beneath it, marking the passage of time, as if untouched by human grief, yet it stood sentinel, above a secret, that had waited patiently, not for discovery but for the moment when the past would no longer be able to hide behind the fragile veil of respectability, silence, or the passage of years. The garden, as Miss Marple often reminded those who would listen, was never just a simple patch of earth growing vegetables and roses. It was a silent witness to countless emotions, a sanctuary where secrets took root and silences deepened into something almost tangible, something that had been growing, patiently, beneath the surface for years. What had been uncovered that day was not simply a forgotten box or mere evidence to solve a puzzle. It was the missing chapter of a story that had been buried in shadows and half-truths, a narrative filled with pain, hope and unspoken longings that had remained locked away until now. Though the villagers might soon turn their eyes elsewhere, the garden itself was destined to remember, to bloom defiantly season after season, its flowers nodding gently over the very ground where a young girl's final thoughts, penned with trembling hands and sealed with fragile hope, had once rested hidden beneath layers of earth and silence. Justice, Miss Marple quietly reflected, did not always announce itself with fanfare or loud declarations. Sometimes it arrived as softly and inevitably, as a leaf twisting in a late autumn breeze, subtle yet impossible to ignore once it had settled. And as the group slowly dispersed with murmurs barely above a whisper and teacups cooling in delicate hands, Miss Marple lingered by the sundial, a symbol now heavy with revelation, humming faintly with the buzz of bees, and the distant clatter of a tea trolley, being wheeled back inside the house. Suddenly, a crow, dark as midnight and dignified in its bearing, descended from a nearby branch and perched on the sundial with a deliberate grace, tilting its sharp head as if sizing her up. Miss Marple's lips curled into a knowing smile as she whispered, "Right on time," a greeting half meant for the bird, half for the silent shadows of the past that seemed to hover nearby. Around her, life quietly resumed. The vicar retreated to his sermon notes, Mrs. Bantry settled back among her cushions, and Major Fullerton set off on his solitary walk, but Miss Marple remained rooted to the spot, her thoughts as steady and unmoving as the stones beneath her feet, her voice soft as the evening breeze when she murmured, "The dead always find their way home," while the crow remained perfectly still, its black eyes reflecting the fading light. The sundial cast a long deliberate shadow, and the garden, having revealed its secrets, fell once more into silence, but not the same silence as before. It was the silence that follows a truth finally spoken, heavy, and filled with a strange peace. Cranford Cottage stood quietly nearby, empty yet dignified, its shutters drawn but unlatched, as if resting rather than abandoned. Inside, the rooms held their breath, still and waiting, while outside, the garden had taken on a new life, defying the quiet with modest clusters of sweet peas, forget-me-nots, and cornflowers, that now bloomed where no one had planted, but where someone had sown seeds in secret, with care and intention. Miss Marple, who noticed details others overlooked, remembered seeing the small seed packets resting quietly on the windowsill weeks before Cecily's departure, seeds the girl never mentioned, yet she had planted them nonetheless, leaving behind a living memory. The soil, once concealing heavy secrets beneath its surface, now seemed to breathe more freely, perfumed faintly with the mingled scents of old grief and new beginnings, as if the earth itself had been unburdened. One slow morning, Miss Marple passed through the gate with an unhurried step, her sharp eyes catching the faintest flicker of color in a new row of foxgloves. A garden no longer haunted by ghosts but warmed by memory, and sometimes she thought that was enough. A few days later, over a freshly brewed pot of Darjeeling and a perfectly baked seed cake, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with her usual bright curiosity, whispering, "I do wonder, Jane, why people go to such lengths to bury their truths, especially when the truth has such a way of finding its own escape." Stirring her tea with practiced elegance, Miss Marple allowed the question to settle like the sweetness steeping into a Victoria sponge before replying. "At first, it is because the truth is inconvenient, then because it becomes dangerous, but finally, because it grows too heavy to carry, and yet too old to explain. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly, though whether it was in understanding or quiet admiration was hard to tell. The tea was excellent, and the silence that followed was warm and companionable, the kind that only comes after a long and sorrowful puzzle has been carefully pieced together. Miss Marple's gaze drifted again toward the garden where clematis began to climb with delicate persistence, weaving green tendrils upward, as if stitching the frayed edges of a story finally told, proof that even buried deep beneath years of silence, the past insists on being heard, and justice, subtle yet unyielding, always finds a way to speak. The garden, once veiled in lingering shadows and heavy with unspoken secrets, now breathed freely, its ivy and climbing roses unfurling again, unhindered by the oppressive cloak of silence that had long smothered its beauty. Miss Marple's voice, barely a whisper, echoed softly to herself. There is a time for concealment, for shadows to hold their secrets close, but even the most carefully buried truths, like stubborn seeds, must eventually bloom. The seed cake laid out that afternoon, simple yet exquisitely moist and fragrant, was unlike anything she had tasted in many a month, each bite a small sweet reprieve from the weight of hidden grief and whispered confessions that had filled the village for weeks. Then, a week later, in a ceremony so quiet it might have been missed by those not meant to witness it, Reverend Phelps gathered a small group beneath the sundial, now lovingly scrubbed clean and restored to its dignified place at the garden's heart. No ornate embellishments or dates adorned the modest plaque, only the poignant inscription, "In memory of Veronica Stone, beloved and believed," words heavy with meaning yet stripped of pomp, carrying the raw weight of sorrow and enduring affection. The gathering was intimate, composed of only a handful of those who truly understood. The murmured prayers hung thick in the warm air. The brief exchanged glances between old friends spoke volumes, and the silence that followed was not awkward or empty, but profound and deliberate, as though the garden itself held its breath in solemn recognition. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, her gloved hands resting lightly on the cool metal of the sundial, watched as its shadow stretched slowly across the garden path, not as a marker of harsh, unforgiving time, but as a silent sentinel of hard-won peace and quiet justice. For years this garden had been a place of mere beauty, a refuge for flowers and simple joys, but now it had grown tender and kind, its every leaf and petal steeped with memory and meaning. As the villagers dispersed one by one, voices softened and footsteps slowed, Miss Marple lingered behind, her expression serene, untouched by grief, yet marked by a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that some truths, no matter how late to emerge, had finally taken root in soil rich enough to nurture them. Turning away at last, the sundial remained steadfast in its stillness, a symbol no longer only of passing hours but of a fragile truce and a gentle justice, planted deep and enduring. Life at St. Mary Me resumed its familiar rhythms. The women gathered again for their knitting circles, the vicar delivered his sermons, and Mrs. Petton, undeterred, resumed her habitual grumbles about the new postmaster's incessant peppermint chewing during morning deliveries. Yet beneath the surface of this everyday normalcy, something had irrevocably shifted. A subtle warmth had softened the way certain names were spoken across shop counters, a tenderness creeping into once curt glances, as if the old wounds, once raw and jagged, had begun to heal beneath the village's collective breath. The story of Veronica Stone, like all village tragedies, began its slow transformation from a sharp, aching sorrow to a gentle nostalgia, woven carefully into the fabric of shared myth and memory. People did not forget entirely, of course, but they began to reframe, to forgive, to fold the pain into stories told with a softer voice. Yet the garden did not forget. Its memory was not a tapestry of rumor or hearsay, but a deep, unyielding record written in shadow and root. It held every footstep that hesitated beneath the sundial, every whispered voice spoken in fear or urgency, every tear that soaked quietly into its earth, and the fragile breath of a name spoken far too late. Though it never spoke aloud, the garden bore witness, patient and unblinking, preserving a truth that some knew well. Some truths, Miss Marple reflected, preferred to be remembered in silence. As evening descended, and the sun slipped beneath the hedge in a wash of soft gold, Miss Marple took her customary slow walk home, her steps unhurried, savoring the final gifts of light that the day offered before dusk claimed the fields. The gentle calls of twilight birds echoed faintly across the open fields, a delicate serenade to the closing day. Passing by the churchyard, where stones weathered by time bore names older than any scandal or whispered secret, she nodded briefly to Mr. Withers sweeping the village hall porch, and then to young Angela Kale walking her dog with a practiced solemnity unique to girls, determined to appear grown beyond their years. The village greeted her not with reverence, but with warm familiarity, for most had only guessed at the fullness of what had truly transpired, and Miss Marple thought that was as it should be. Some mysteries were meant to be solved, others merely understood, and some, wrapped in human sorrow rather than criminal ambition, were meant to close gently, like the soft click of a garden gate closing behind a long winding path. She reached her small cozy cottage just as the evening breeze stirred the curtains, the kettle already humming softly on the stove, promising warmth and quiet comfort. There was no grand conclusion, no applause or celebration, only the quiet profound reward of having listened well, having noticed the subtle signs hidden beneath everyday life, and knowing with a certainty as steady as the sundial's shadow, that justice, soft yet resolute, had taken root in this small corner of the world, destined to bloom quietly, firmly, and forevermore. And so, beneath the quiet shadowed hedges of St. Mary Me, another mystery was gently laid to rest, not with clamor or scandal, but with the soft hush of truth carefully uncovered. What had begun as nothing more than a single white glove, quietly placed in the garden, grew into a path of remembrance, forgiveness, and a quiet kind of justice. Miss Marple, as ever, perceived not just what others overlooked but what they feared to confront, the deep-rooted memories that entwine themselves with the very soil we tread upon, and how silence, when broken with tenderness and care, can bring peace rather than pain. Yet this tale leaves us with a lingering question, as subtle and haunting as the fading light. If you were in Cecil's place, would you have dared to unearth the truth after so many years, knowing it might bring no formal justice, only a personal closure? Or would you have allowed the past to slumber beneath the sundial forever, cloaked in its quiet shadow? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, for your reflections do more than spark conversation, they help fellow mystery lovers find their way to our little corner of storytelling. If this tale stirred something within you, if you delight in stepping into Miss Marple's world, where nothing is ever quite as it seems, then be sure to subscribe for more mysteries like this, where old secrets bloom anew and truth lingers just beneath the surface. And if you know a friend or family member who adores classic detective fiction, please share this video with them. Until next time, stay curious, stay observant, and keep your teacup close. You never know when the next mystery might quietly knock upon your door.